President Trump's hour-long media blitz this morning, he made a number of inaccurate or misleading statements about the Inspector General's report on the FBI's handling of the 2016 election.
The IG report came out yesterday. The FBI looks bad.
Very bad.
Your FBI.
Well, no, it's Comey. But the top people were horrible. You look at what happened. They were plotting against my election. Probably has never happened like that in terms of intelligence, in terms of anything else. Right. But they were actually plotting against my election.
The headline right now from the Wall Street Journal, DOJ Clinton report blasts Comey and agents, but finds no bias in conclusion.
Well, the end result was wrong. I mean, there was total bias. It was a pretty good report. And then I say that the IG blew it at the very end with that statement, because when you read the report, it was almost like Comey. He goes point after point about how guilty Hillary is. Mm-hmm. And then he said, but we're not going to do anything about it. The report, the IG report, was a horror show. I thought that one sentence of conclusion was ridiculous.
Much of what the president said today isn't true. According to the roughly 500-page report, there was, quote, no evidence that improper considerations, including political bias, directly affected the investigation. Trump also falsely claimed the report exonerated him. That's something that was not addressed by the Inspector General. Let's watch.
If you read the IG report, I've been totally exonerated.
As far as I'm concerned, it had nothing to do.
Take a look at it. Take a look at the investigation.
For more, I'm joined by Philip Bump, Washington Post political reporter, and Benjamin Wittes, MSNBC legal analyst and lawfare editor-in-chief from Washington. Philip, let me start with you. Let's be clear what this IG Inspector General report covered. This was about the FBI's handling of the investigation of Hillary Clinton and the email issue in 2016. This was not Trump, Russia, the sort of stuff we talk about in terms of Russia and collusion.
That's exactly right. I mean, it was a little broader than that. I mean, it also included, for example, these text messages that were going back and forth between FBI employees Peter Strzok and Lisa Page. It addressed this other issue of an FBI employee who apparently had given a heads up to John Podesta about this other thing. There's a lot that was in there, but it focused on the campaign. It focused on what had been done during the campaign by the FBI and whether or not there had been a violation of the FBI's prohibitions against bias in their investigations. And what it found, as you just heard, was that there were things that they were worried about, red flags that were raised, but they found that these investigations were not actually tainted by that bias.
Right. So when the president says he's been exonerated by, is there any sense what he's referring to? Is there something in there that he can hang that on? Is there any sense at all what that reference means? So
I'm extremely skeptical that President Trump spent much time actually reading the document. And what I would guess is that President Trump he makes broad claims and then seizes upon little things to validate them. And so he has two operating theories among many about the Mueller investigation. One is Comey was bad. The other is the FBI was biased. In that report, you can make arguments to both of those points. You can make points, this "We'll Stop Trump" text that came out in the report. There's evidence of the FBI bias. Obviously, there was a lot about Comey in there. Comey is bad. Therefore, everything Donald Trump said about Comey and the FBI is accurate. Therefore, Donald Trump is exonerated. I feel as though we're all 3 years into this by now. We have a decent sense of how Donald Trump's brain works. I think that's where he may be going. But there certainly is nothing from a categorical sense that exonerates him about the Russia investigation at all. Yeah,
and Ben Wittes, let me bring you in this, because I know you have a relationship with Jim Comey. I know you've written about him quite a bit. I do want to ask you about the Comey piece of this, because if we separate what the president's saying, what the president's claiming, this report does really drill down on James Comey, his conduct during the 2016 campaign as it relates to the Clinton email investigation. And it's pretty scathing. It accuses him of insubordination at one point. If you go back to that, well, let me ask you about this in particular. This is where they say insubordination. They say that press conference he held in the summer of 2016, where he said he's not going to recommend charges against Hillary Clinton. But then he essentially, in the court of public opinion, it seemed, indicted her anyway. The Clinton people have looked back at that and said that's something that cost her dearly in the 2016 campaign, something he never should have done. And this report is saying that the act of doing that press conference without giving a heads up to the Justice Department represented insubordination. Do you think that's a fair conclusion?
Look, I mean, I think that, Jim did the things he did. I have defended some of them, had anxieties about others. By the way, I was one of a very small number of people to raise anxieties about this publicly, about the substance of that press conference at the time that it happened. you know, he did the things that he did. He's accountable for them. The IG characterizes them the way the IG characterizes them. Jim has responded by saying he respects the IG's work, though he disagrees with the conclusions. There's never been a doubt factually about what happened here. These were tough choices. Jim made the ones that he made, and he has to stand up to history and its judgments in response. And I think he's actually pretty comfortable with that.
What do you make of it, though? I mean, the FBI director giving that press conference in the heat of a campaign, and then again, the one that the Hillary Clinton folks, to this day, Hillary Clinton herself has said publicly, thinks cost her the election, that letter 10 days before the election. What do you think that was proper?
So I think the merits of these questions are very different. I had problems with the press conference at the time that it happened, and I still think that that was not the greatest idea in the world. I also think, by the way, that it was not in the highest traditions of the Justice Department for the Attorney General to play no role in the question of what was said at the end of that investigation. So the problem was both that Comey chose to give that statement, but also the problem was also that the Attorney General chose to just kind of sit there and let him do it. I think something very similar about the October letter. I think it was probably not a great thing to do. And I think the problem was both that Jim took it upon himself to make that announcement, but also that Sally Yates and Loretta Lynch didn't pick up the phone and, knowing he was planning to do it, and say, no, you're actually our subordinate, don't do that. So I think, I think there were a lot of mistakes here, but I'm not. I think the distribution of blame is a little bit broader than the IG describes it, in my view, anyway.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.